You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 215, or 27th Q&A. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Pretty good.
Well, this is our second week in Israel, so hopefully things are going good.
Hopefully.
We're not actually live right now on the air in Israel, but this is week 2 of the Israel trip, so hopefully everything's good.
So, like I put on the Facebook page, I don't know, months and months ago, I'm not a prophet, but it would be handy, right here.
It would be.
Sorry.
If anybody is a prophet out there, shoot me an email at treystrickland@gmail.com. And you could also send me your questions for the Q&A at that email address too.
Right. You want it in time for the fantasy draft. I know what you're angling for.
Oh, I don't need any help with fantasy.
Oh, yeah. Right.
I'm all good there. I'm all
I
good
forgot.
there. Hey, the NFL draft just happened last week. How'd your team walk away?
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I'm happy.
Yeah. Cowboys did phenomenal as always. So,
of course,
I can't complain. We all know. All right. People probably don't want us to continue talking about American football. So why don't we just get into our questions of the week?
Good idea.
Our first two are from Marion. And the first question is, could Dr. Heiser explain what the exact sin of Nadab and Abihu was? Does strange fire mean coals from somewhere other than the altar? Was it because it was not Aaron offering the incense? Wasn't incense supposed to be burned on the incense altar?
Well, this is a pretty easy one. I'm going to suggest to Marion that episode 73 in our Leviticus series, specifically the episode on Leviticus 10, answers all those questions. So I don't think I can sort of condense that in 2 minutes and improve on it. So that's my answer. Go listen to episode 73.
Only if eventually, Mike, we're going to have every answer to every question.
Right.
Just go listen to certain episodes. So I like that.
Right.
All right.
Of course.
Question 2 is, what is Mike's opinion on the lost chapter of Acts found in Constantinople?
Well, I had never actually heard of this lost chapter of Acts found in Constantinople. So I looked it up. It was discovered and published in 1871, this supposed lost chapter. There are 0 peer-reviewed articles on it. There are also 0 dissertations. That's a bad sign. In other words, this has all the trappings of some sort of paleobabble kind of document that no scholar since 1871 has thought enough of to actually do any study on it. So again, that's a bad sign. But for the sake of learning about it, I did do some looking online, since I don't have anything peer reviewed to go to, and we'll put this link on the episode website in case people want to see this. But again, this manuscript found in the late 1870s purports to be the Acts 29, a missing chapter of the book of Acts. There are some really good, at this link, there's some really good questions to ask. And again, these are the kinds of things that just make the whole thing stink. Where's the original manuscript? Now, the writer at this particular website notes this. The manuscript, if it existed at all, was found in the possession of a sultan in the late 1700s or early 1800s at the earliest. The information about the manuscript was first published in 1871, almost 150 years ago. There's nothing in terms of research databases or whatnot that show that the manuscript has been seen by anyone else in the last 150 years. The actual, original manuscript, or what purports to be the original manuscript. That's a bad sign. That means that scholars can't take this original manuscript, presumably, of course, written in Greek, if this was Luke's hand, and a copy of something produced by Luke, like the rest of the book of Acts. There are literally millions, I'm not exaggerating, millions of Greek manuscripts from the period, not just of the New Testament. I'm talking about the like Koine Greek, fragments of Greek material from the first couple centuries before, and go on into the early Christian centuries, overlapping with the era of the New Testament, that have been found and cataloged, and scholars work on them, put them into databases and whatnot. And to see that nobody knows where this one is highly suspicious. Another question he asks is, where are the references in ancient literature to a lost chapter of Acts? Does anyone ever talk about something at the end, this chapter being lost? Or does anyone ever talk about how Acts should not end at chapter 28? And the answer is no. Nobody even suggests that anything has been lost from the end of the book of Acts. So again, another really, really bad sign. Now, if you do any reading on this, you'll find out that there are things in this presumed lost chapter that are used to promote the idea of British Israelism. And that pretty much is the death blow. This has, again, all the marks of a manuscript contrived, made up, to enforce an idea in the 19th century. Remember, this was supposedly came out in 1871. This is one of those eras, 19th century, early 20th century, where this idea of British Israelism, that the British Isles, the people there are vestiges of the lost tribes of Israel, that kind of thing. This is one of the eras where this was a big deal. And so, again, this has all the marks of something made up just to promote this idea. So what do I think of it? Not much.
Jared's question is about episode 103, the Moses and the Bronze Serpent episode. And Dr. Heiser talks about how, as he often does, Genesis 1 through 11 is a polemic of later Babylonian creation and flood stories, and therefore, most likely 1 through 11 was written during the Babylonian exile. I was telling my wife this, and she asked, why couldn't it be the other way around? I didn't have an answer. I've heard from nearly every scholar that Genesis is a polemic of the Mesopotamian stories, but I honestly don't know why. Couldn't someone just as easily say Genesis 1 through 11 was written first and those stories are polemics of Genesis? What are the reasons this is not the case?
Because the Babylonian material is demonstrably older by a long shot. Let's just take, broadly speaking, you've got creation stories from, that are Sumerian, others that are going to be Akkadian. All of this, it sort of gets lumped together. It's Mesopotamian material, whether it's Akkadian from the Babylonian period or whatever, some other period than Sumerian. So the Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Akkadian stuff about creation stories that have parallels, or not, parallels is a fair word in some cases, but that somehow have a literary or a conceptual, worldview correspondence to stuff in Genesis 1 through 11 is centuries, even millennia older than the biblical material. So it can't work the other way around. Now, if we narrow that to, let's just say, Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story that is essentially written to glorify Marduk. Now, if you believe that, even if you believe that, let's say that Genesis 1 through 11 was written by Moses, so let's just give it a round number, 1500 BC. That would be 900, to maybe 1,000 years earlier than the Marduk story. Okay, that would be the case. Now, that still doesn't help because a lot of the details of the Marduk story are older than that. It's just that in this particular creation story, the details are changed and manipulated to make Marduk the greatest of all gods and all that kind of stuff. So there are still threads, even in that later text, that predate the biblical material. If you're with most scholars, and I've said before, I think Genesis 1 through 11 was either probably a combination, composed and heavily edited during the exile, specifically to respond to the theology of the captors of the two tribes there held in Babylon. If you believe that, then the creation story, Enuma Elish, again, the Marduk creation story, and the Hebrew Bible, specifically this material in Genesis 1 through 11, is really coming into being at roughly the same time. So it would be you're not even really helped by that, because then you have to assume, and this is my second trajectory on this, Why would we assume that an elite scribal class of Mesopotamians feel it's worth their time at all to respond to something a captive Jewish scribe is writing? You only do polemic if you think something is a threat to you. If you're the Babylonians and the Jews are your captives, they're not going anywhere without your permission. And who's paying attention to what they do religiously? We're living in Babylon. It's not like the Jews have either the ability in terms of production or the permission to write something down and then distribute it throughout the empire. And then Babylonian scribes look at that and go, oh boy, we need to respond to this. Doesn't make any sense. They're not going to care one whit about what a bunch of captives are writing about their own theology and their own history. So, looking at it in reverse just doesn't make any sense. You have the chronological problem with the material from the get-go, but even if it was contemporaneous, and some of it is, but not a whole lot of it, why would an empire power like Babylon care about responding to the literature of a captive people? There'd be no need. We're not afraid of your God. You're sitting here in Babylon. Our God conquered your God. Why should we care what you're writing? So it just doesn't make sense, either chronologically or sort of in the circumstances of the day.
Our next question is from Jack. This probably seems like a weird question, but when Jesus was being tempted in the desert and was offered all the nations in return for Jesus worshiping the tempter, why would this not have fulfilled the mission? In Jesus' mind, he would be, quote, sacrificing himself to rescue the nations, which at the time, if he didn't have foreknowledge of the entire plan, would seem to have accomplished his goal.
Well, according to what we read in the New Testament about the temptation, Jesus wasn't sacrificing himself. He wouldn't have been sacrificing himself. So I think the premise of the question sort of undermines the question. The trade-off is worshiping Satan. It doesn't say the trade-off is, well, let me put you to death. We can't read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, back into the account of, what's going on with Jesus and Satan in the desert. And I'm not saying that the questioner is, but that's a sort of a familiar analogy to a lot of modern people because of the popularity of C.S. Lewis and that particular book. But Satan never demands Jesus' life. He doesn't demand the death. The trade-off is worshiping Satan. And I would say that you need a death. You can't be, the Old Testament has lots of resurrection talk, and the basis of the resurrection is at stake here. You can't have, you need the first fruits of the resurrection. You need death conquered. Okay, and if we have the Lamb of God slain before the foundation of the world, that suggests that he has to die, and then to conquer death, he has to be raised again. So there are a number of theological ideas at stake here that just bowing down to Satan without having a death and a resurrection, it just doesn't accomplish what needs to be accomplished. Then you have like typology of sacrifices, the blood sacrifice thing. I mean, there's that element as well. So honestly, it just doesn't fit. There's another issue here, though, that we don't want to overlook, and that is the mission of Jesus wasn't only about reclaiming the nations. Okay, we can't just funnel the mission of the incarnation, the whole plan of God, to be about reclaiming the nations. We have a number of problems that the Messiah has to fix. One of which is the death problem, the estrangement from God problem, and the loss of immortality for humankind. So you can't have death defeated unless you defeat death, and you can't defeat death unless you die and then conquer it. So we have these sort of theological and conceptual elements to think about when it comes to the mission. And then when it comes to what the trade-off is, this whole thing about worshiping Satan, since it doesn't involve, the death and the resurrection, it can't be viewed as satisfying, the whole point of the mission.
All right, our next question is from Jad. In Genesis 7:19-20, there is mention of the floodwaters exceeding the heights of the mountains by 15 cubits. Is it possible that this statement is another example of a polemic by the biblical authors against the gods and their high places? Whenever I've been involved in discussion with fellow Christians about the flood event, this verse is often cited to justify the flood as a truly worldwide event. How should I understand this text?
Yeah, I don't think you can get a polemic here. If we're this is peripherally, I would say really peripherally related to time of authorship. You could say that someone later, writing later, either Moses, but even that's a hard sell, because what you need is a proliferation of high places in Israel, so that people know what in the world's going on here. But that's really not the referent of the mountaintops. There's no indication that there's any specific top that you could say, oh yeah, that XYZ god from Babylon lives there, and the author's shooting at that deity. There's nothing in the passage like that. People, there wouldn't have been any high places at the time of the flood. There isn't, the worship of other gods at the time of the flood, so that rules it out. And if you're going with what the later writers would have known about high places, you would expect them to sort of plant something in there that would help the reader identify specifically that feature. Because as the reader reads this, the reader's not assuming, that there's any worship of other gods at the time either. The reader would have to be directed to something specific and then mentally associate that something specific with a deity current, that's part of their current knowledge base. And there's just nothing like that. But having said that, I think there's a problem generally, or at least a conceivable problem, with using the reference to, water over the mountains by 15 cubits, using that to justify a global flood. I mean, on my website, I posted my little, thought experiment that, hey, and the reason I did this, I think, is evident from the first paragraph. We should not, those listeners out there who prefer the global flood, fine. I wrote what I wrote on my website to make this point, and really only this point, that it's wrong for you to presume that the local regional view has no biblical argument. It actually does have a pretty good biblical argument. It's not that hard to make a text-based argument for a local regional event as opposed to a global flood. And so I wanted people to know that, because if for some reason, it becomes like impossible, to believe in a global flood at some point, in the future, that shouldn't trouble you about the Bible, because it's very easy to make a text-based argument for a local regional view. And going back to this wording here, you have to ask yourself, questions like, okay, 15 cubits above the mountaintops, okay, the high mountains. Well, how high is high? It doesn't matter how much the water overwhelms it. If you have a hill that's 1,000 feet tall, like in a regional event, and that's overcovered, by 15 cubits, well, that's impressive, but that's not like you're talking about Mount Everest. Okay, how high is high? What's a mountain? Because the same word used for mountain in the flood account can be used for hill elsewhere. Again, I point these things out in the process of that article. So a lot of people will take this language and sort of assume they have this compelling, this deeply compelling argument, but they really don't, and they fail. They get distracted, I think, unfortunately, from addressing the arguments of the local regional view, which they have to do. A lot of people who take the global view of the floods don't think they have anything to refute. They do. And the issue of context is really significant, because if we look at the flood account that the whole earth, quote unquote, the whole earth, kol eretz, is overcome with water. Well, all a local regional view person has to do is say, well, look at the context for that. Look at Genesis 9:19. Here's what it says. These three, talking about Shem, Ham, and Japheth, sons of Noah, these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. It defines whole earth as the peoples and, of course, the lands that extend from Noah. In other words, it's the nations in the table of nations. And that table of nations has nothing to say about Australia, China, North America, South America, Central America, Canada, either polar region. It has nothing to say at all about most of the planet. Instead, it's a region. It's the Central Eastern Mediterranean. You throw Tarshish in there, you get the whole Mediterranean. And then what we know as the Middle East, Tigris and Euphrates Valley, on up into Asia Minor and Turkey. So is it conceivable, that there was a flood that encompassed a huge portion of that region of the world? Because that's how the biblical writers in Genesis 9 define, quote, the whole earth, unquote. So that's what you, as a global flood proponent, you have to deal with that kind of argument, which is another, really why I put it up there as well, to show people that, look, this is not a hill worth dying on, the flood issue, the flood debate. And it's incorrect for global flood believers, proponents, to just presume they have no argument. They have nothing to refute. This is so self-evident. I have nothing to refute here. It's actually incorrect. There are a number of things here to think about. So I don't think it's a really good use, of that idea there, this cubit thing over the tops of the mountains, because it's just, the description itself is malleable. It requires definition. And if you have an argument that requires definition, it's not that great of an argument.
All right, Mike. Well, we're going to end here, short and sweet. Hopefully it's long enough to get somebody to their commute to their work or office. So we'll go ahead and stop the episode here, Mike. But again, second week in Israel. Can you give us any idea of what you're going to be talking about, or you're winging it?
Well, I'm going to look at where we're going to be and pull out a few things that I think are interesting about either the location or kind of why that place was important in the flow of biblical history. And hopefully, there'll be some interesting things about Israelite religion along the way. There are some obvious ones, like go to Mount Carmel. Okay, that's where Elijah had the confrontation with the prophets of Baal. That's easy. It's not so easy in other parts, but we'll see. We'll see. Just pull a few of those things out and chat about them.
All right. Well, continue prayers for us, if you will, listeners, please. And please go check us out on Facebook and subscribe to Mike's newsletter at drmsh.com and follow him on Twitter, if you will. And I want to thank Mike for answering our questions, and I want to thank everybody else for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.